critical time for wild pandas. Their precious bamboo began to flower and became inedible.
83年左右吧，那个时候由于这个建筑开花，很多这个大熊猫没有食物，那么就它们非常的面临非常大的这个生活方面有很大的威胁。那个时候我们抢救了很多大熊猫，我们的研究工作也从那个时候就逐步的推开了。
The work seemed straightforward. The plan was to rescue starving wild pandas and then breed more pandas from them. But this seemingly simple task took a long time to achieve, and it wasn't until 20 years later that Wulong witnessed the fruits of successful breeding. In 2006, a record-breaking 18 panda cubs were produced. The following year, another 14 panda cubs were born. There are now more than 60 pandas at the centre, and another 80 live at zoos and research centres in China and abroad. But even though Wulong is full to capacity, there still aren't enough captive pandas.
每年都有至少在15只以上这么数的增加，但是从我们来看，从我们国际国的专家我们共同探讨的结果来看，就是说我们要保持这个圈养物种达到一个稳定的状态，我们需要达到一个300只的水平。达到300只什么意思呢？就能保存这个物种。 我相信我们在这种繁殖的速度下，我相信还有7到8年时间来达到一个300只的水平。
So the race goes on. Contrary to popular belief, wild pandas breed as easily as any other bear. But captive pandas have always been a problem, even here at Wulong. Only about a quarter of pandas are able to go into estrus naturally, and only 1 in 10 male pandas are able to mate naturally. And they have precious little time to do so.
我们是这样的，熊猫交配实际上这个时间是很短的。你刚才说的3天还不尽然，有些熊猫可能是3天，比如说那种刚刚性成熟的熊猫时间长一点，但是有些熊猫，比如说岁数大一点的熊猫，年龄比较长一点的熊猫，交配时间可能只有2个小时，是非常非常紧急的。
As this year's mating season starts at Wulong, the pressure mounts. It's almost the end of March. There are 16 females already in estrus. Merely 3 mating males, only 8 breeding pens available, and just a few days to get the job done. And those aren't the only problems. Pandas are just as particular about their partners as humans.
当然，这个里面也很复杂的。我跟你说，雌性的熊猫性选择非常严的，就是它喜欢这个熊猫，它不喜欢另外一只。你那边从遗传管理，我就不让它配种，但是这个雌性我不喜欢它，我要选择它。这个情况也是很难的。这熊猫的性选择是双方的，有时候雄性呢选择雌性，但是有时候雌性也选择雄性。
And saving the species can sometimes be thwarted by the simple fact that some pandas can't stand the sight of each other. It's day one of Wulong's annual breeding bonanza. On the male team are 3 wild-caught pandas, Wugang, Ling Ling, and of course Wulong's star stud, Lulu. Their wild genes are crucial to the breeding program, as many of the females are captive bred. The 3 males are expected to service all the females currently in estrus, but the limited number of breeding pens means there's only room for 5 females at any one time. They constantly have to be moved into position, in and out of different pens, while the males stay put. One of the first females to show signs of readiness is 13-year-old Fei Fei, whose name means concubine. She makes her feelings and heightened hormonal state as plain as her name. As in any proper relationship, the couple have to be formally introduced before matters can be taken any further. Wugang, as the first potential suitor, is kept indoors initially, so that both parties can have a risk-free mutual assessment. Fei Fei's behaviour makes it impossible for anyone to ignore. Except, it seems, Wugang. His mind is clearly focused on higher things, such as his stomach. But Fei Fei simply doesn't have the luxury of waiting for Wugang to finish his dinner. Her estrogen level is peaking and will soon dip again. She will be at her most fertile and must find a more reliable mate quickly.
Lulu 要德行还是可以让他走。
露可以。
Lulu 有那个就可以，没得问题。其实那个Lulu的血还是好的嘛。只要Lulu喜欢，只要发出羊叫声就可以放。就害怕不出羊叫声，不出羊叫声非打不可。
But the first problem is to get Lulu indoors before Fei Fei can safely enter his den. A seemingly simple task, but Lulu has other ideas. In the wild, the higher a male leaves his mark, the stronger and more virile he's considered, and the more attractive he is to the ladies. With Lulu safely indoors, it's time to introduce Fei Fei. At first sight, it seems that Lulu, like Wugang, isn't at all interested in Fei Fei. But the keeper's experience tells a different story. It may be early for the adults, but for the products of last year's mating, it's well past their bedtime. Not that many of the cubs make a distinction between sleep and activity. As evening draws on, Feifei's hormone level peaks, and as it begins to fall, the pressure is on for one of the male pandas to perform. Despite his earlier lack of interest, the keepers decide to give Wu Geng another go. At first, things seem to be going well. But then Wu Geng seems to lose all sense of direction. Feifei, in turn, loses patience with him and vents her frustration. Disappointed keepers take an even more disappointed Feifei back to her own pen. It's time to bring Lulu in again. To everyone's relief, not least Feifei's, tonight's mating is a success. Copulation lasts a highly satisfactory 6 minutes and 29 seconds. Having been up most of the night, Lulu is in need of a little rest and recuperation. Wu Geng, however, still has a healthy appetite. But his lackluster performance the previous day has serious implications. Half of the centre's female pandas' estrogen levels are now peaking. They need to be mated soon, or there won't be enough pandas next year. They cannot rely solely on Lulu, despite his successful track record, because they must introduce more males to the breeding group and widen the gene pool.
我们要考虑遗传多样性，尽量让它不让一个熊猫表达的太多，它有一个替代作用，就是逐步的淘汰的。从理论上讲是很少的，所以我们要尽量考虑这个遗传多样性，但是乳鹿也不能繁殖太多。
Ling Ling, the third male on the team, is introduced to Cao Cao. But things don't quite work out. He appears no more adept at mating than Wu Geng. Reinforcements are required. They come in the shape of Chung Chung, whose name means strong. He's actually a 21-year-old male panda in the process of losing his teeth and hair. Chung Chung might not seem an ideal solution to the problem, but he's not expected to perform in the same way as the other males. With the female panda's biological clocks ticking away, Chung Chung has a more indirect but vital role to play. His semen has just been collected in the hospital, and while he recovers from the anaesthetic, his contribution to the breeding programme will be put to good use. As has happened many times before. Chung Chung has been a vital, if unwitting, participant in the plan to save the planet's precious pandas. Fei, having been successfully mated with Lulu, will now undergo artificial insemination. Many of the breeding females at Wulong are artificially inseminated as well as being mated naturally.
自然交配以后，我们再让它做人工受精，这个双胞胎率要增加30%左右。
Twins have played a crucial part in reaching Wulong's breeding target and making it a success story. Before Fei can undergo artificial insemination, she needs to be anaesthetised. She must be thoroughly checked over and, most importantly, weighed to ensure that the right amount of anaesthetic is administered. Once sedated, she's raced to the hospital so that the artificial insemination can be completed before she wakes up. The calculations were apparently wrong. But for safety, they erred on the side of caution. Too little is better than too much. The artificial insemination is completed and Fei is put in a quiet enclosure away from the breeding pens. They won't know for sure if it was successful until late summer, when the birthing season begins. Many of the other females in the block are also stimulated by the comings and goings in the other pens. Shishi starts chirping and moaning very loudly, and it's decided to try Wu Gung to see if she is more his type than Fei. Shishi is visibly irritated by Wu Gung's apparent incompetence. She turns on him. Then Wu Gung suddenly reveals another side to his character. Perhaps he's not the apathetic, passive panda he appears to be. Despite his outburst, the keepers know Wu Gung's true character and easily tempt him away from Shishi with his real interest in life. Lulu, meanwhile, is being reacquainted with his very first love, Ying Ying. Like Lulu, she was a wild caught panda, but at 8 years older, more mature and experienced. But Lulu's lost that loving feeling and shows absolutely no interest. Disappointed, they move her through to Wugang. But no joy. Aware that Ying Ying's hormone level has peaked and is dropping, there's a sense of urgency. But persisting with Lulu backfires horribly. It may look frightening, but the keepers aren't worried. The centre's director is also unperturbed by the violence and points to an even more logical explanation for the aggression.
因为在野外，你知道它是要靠打，它打了以后很辛苦，就是它消耗了很多的能量，然后它进行交配，交配以后它再没有这个能力来打这个雌性熊猫了。那这样的情况它不一样，因为它没有打斗，是我们人为的安排，所以它能量很充足。它这个交配以后呢，它还有这个能量要想征服这个雌性熊猫，还想打这个。
As is painfully evident when Lulu is introduced to Long Shin.
这种情况当然是有一定危险性的，没有生命的危险，就是说熊猫，当然就我刚才说到，耳朵掉了，嘴给拉裂了，眼睛给打瞎的，这都有，但是还有手掌给撕开了，这些都有，但是没有死亡的可能性。
Perhaps best illustrated when Ling Ling is introduced to Mei Cheng, and the situation becomes even more violent. She races next door to try to get away from him. Once safely indoors, Mei Cheng is clearly terrified, but only suffers minor cuts and scratches. Nothing serious.
我们在野外这么多年没有发现有交配把熊猫给打到死亡的是没有的。
Comparing the behaviour of captive pandas and their wild relatives is an important part of Wulong's work. The long-term plan is to release some of Wulong's pandas into the wild. One of the reasons there are only 8 breeding pens available out of a possible 10 is because 2 of the pens are currently being used by the release team. As more and more females start to come into estrus, the breeding team thinks they should have priority over the pens.
要它那个我们这个靠是皮可以给防止那个口气强一点，这些人啊，到时候那个完成不了任务找哪个麻烦？还不是找我们底下是这样嘛？是人没法强，我们这边是主要的，他那边犯规那边也算是主要，但是我们肯定要考虑我们这边。
你做10年你可以退出，这只是手机。
他不是现在就要。
我清楚这个问题。
Once they've successfully reached the target of 300 pandas for a sustainable captive population, the hope is to use those pandas to help reach a sustainable wild population of 3,000. But the centre's director is sceptical.
我认为大熊猫这个野生大熊猫要摆脱濒危，并不是说我们野生大熊猫要，我们圈养大熊猫要繁殖多少，野生大熊猫才摆脱濒危。它不可能说无限制的增加，因为每个大熊猫它活动的范围从3平方公里到15平方公里，它有一个活动范围的。在这么个大范围内，不可能说你从一只熊猫跟它增加的很大，所以在野生大熊猫这个种群数量方面，你要快速的增加是不可能的。所以说，我只能说我们人工繁殖的情况下，尽最大努力来满足这个圈养大熊猫一个可持续发展。所以说，你种群数量全国的那个野生大熊猫种群数量要达到3000只，这只是我们希望它达到。
The real problem for wild pandas remains the lack of protected habitat. This is part of that precious protected habitat. 850 kilometres northeast of Wulong, 6,000 feet up in the Qinling Mountains. On the site of an ancient Buddhist temple, a team of scientists at the Qinling Giant Panda Research Base have been studying the behaviour of wild pandas for more than a decade. The damp climate may be good for bamboo and pandas, but it's not so good for humans trying to study them. When there is a break in the clouds, observing the behaviour of wild pandas is considered easier here than in Sichuan.
"到这边来了，看见大熊猫的频率呢，那个频率还是比较高的，相对于四川那边来说，四川在野外要看见一只大熊猫非常困难。在这里呢，它那个一个是地形非常平坦，另外一个熊猫种群密度非常高。
The density may be higher than in Sichuan, but there are still only around 60 to 100 pandas living in an area of around 300 square kilometres. And searching for these elusive wild pandas to study requires long treks, sometimes for several days, and climbing thousands of feet. As at Wulong, it's the spring mating season, and the chances of seeing pandas in the wild are increased because the pandas come down to the lower slopes to mate. Until a female is successfully mated, a number of males will congregate wherever she leaves her scent marks. The task of finding and filming giant pandas is still far from simple. But after a long and exhausting climb, the sound of loud bleating and chirping raises hopes of a chance to get close enough to study them. Not too close. Like any wild bear, they're very dangerous, especially at a time like this.
但是发现树上有只熊猫，那树下有只 有只熊猫，但树上那只熊猫是母熊猫，树下的这只熊猫是公熊猫，然后是在离这只公熊猫那个不远的地方还有2只公熊猫。
This is a very rare sighting of one of Feifei's distant wild cousins. From the growls, it's obvious the males will have no energy left for fighting, as Lulu does with the females in Wulong. Since the last national survey of panda numbers in 2001, which calculated that there were around 1,600 wild pandas, scientists here have completed another survey of a number of reserves and subsequently come up with a very surprising result.
所以我们估计可能目前全国野生大熊猫总数量可能有2000到3000只。
The wild panda population might have already reached the magical figure of 3,000. But Dr. Zhang Zejun still doesn't consider this to be a sustainable population and believes that the giant panda remains an endangered species. And even if the future looks a little brighter for pandas, another ominous threat to the survival of the species is emerging. High in the Qinling Mountains, research scientist He Jiangbo has been observing the pandas' food as closely as the pandas themselves. Here, they eat around 20 kilos of bamboo every day, mainly Bashana bamboo. And he's discovered something very worrying.
这就是巴山墨竹所开的花，巴山墨竹开花以后，它会死亡，死亡以后，这熊猫就会因为食物胆怯而死亡。在上世纪80年代，四川呢就发生了大面积的竹林开花。在秦岭，现在在秦岭地区也曾面临着这个问题。
Ancient folklore says that when bamboo flowers, death and destruction follow, and modern science agrees. The bamboo will die within 3 to 5 years after flowering. Then the seeds will drop into the soil, but will take another 7 to 10 years to germinate and become edible once more. If panda numbers really have risen to 3,000, they're now at risk of plummeting again.
目前呢，就是我们的研究小组就说是，我们想通过就是改变这个竹林的结构，是否能达到它延缓竹子的开花的这样的一个结果。大家知道，竹子开花是一个不可避免的过程，一般就说是它是60到100年，它是一个周期，一个生命周期。这个时间现在没有一个统一的定论。
While they struggle to avoid the same fate that befell the pandas in Wulong, ultimately, scientists here are absolutely clear about what needs to be done to protect giant pandas, whether there are 1,600 or as many as 3,000.
我认为应该是2个方面，一个方面呢是保护好现有的野生大熊猫的种群，包括保护好它的栖息地，尽量减少对它栖息地里边各种外的因素的干扰。另外一个方面呢，那就是必须加快圈养大熊猫的饲养繁殖，加强有关野生大熊猫放归方面的科学研究以及其他方面的准备工作，争取在最短的时间内尽快 将那个圈养大熊猫成功的放归到野外去。
Back at Wulong, they're getting on with the first part of that task, making more pandas. It's now April, the peak of the breeding season, and as more and more females come into estrus, the keepers are under increasing pressure. Whether they'll reach this year's target depends a great deal on Wu Gung, who seems to have no sense of urgency. Despite his hopeless history, the keepers are encouraged by Wu Gung's burst of energy during his earlier encounter with Shishi. They've decided to reintroduce him to Ying Ying. Wu Gung, however, seems to have reverted to his old ways, suffering from an apparent lack of coordination. Things seem to be going in ever-decreasing circles. As Wu Gung looks around, as if he's desperate for encouragement or support, disappointed keepers decide to cut the meeting short and tempt him away. Wu Gung obviously interprets the apple as sustenance and hangs on, while Ying Ying is clearly unimpressed with the entire performance. After yet another disappointment, the last chance is the other male in the group, Ling Ling. But Ling Ling isn't being very cooperative. The reason for Ling Ling's obstinate behaviour is in the voluptuous shape of a new female in the pens, Shi Mei, which means happy and lucky girl. Shi Mei's scent drives Ling Ling crazy, and her appeal isn't limited to him. Shi Mei appears to be a source of passion and delight to all the boy bears, most of all Lulu. She successfully mated with both Ling Ling and Lulu in 2006 and subsequently gave birth to twins. But last year, Shi Mei mysteriously came into estrus 6 months late, which was a source of concern for the keepers and Lulu alike, and resulted in the latter banging against the side of his pen for weeks on end. Shi Mei has now returned to a normal cycle, and it's having a big impact on all her neighbours. There's something about this panda that drives wild pandas even wilder. Surely even Wu Gung will find her charms impossible to ignore. Alas, not. With Lulu gazing longingly at the love of his life, things between Shi Mei and Wu Gung follow a familiar path. At one point, the roles are even reversed. finally the moment arrives for lovesick Lulu to show Wu Gung how it's done. But instead of leaping on Shimei in his usual domineering way, Lulu romps about with her and they play like small cubs. Both behave like mating is just a big game. It's hard to believe that Lulu is the same panda that was so aggressive with the other females. She may, or may not, be the love of his life. Their coupling looks likely to succeed without any of the drama and violence that marred other matings. But whether their relationship will result in cubs capable of being released into the wild, it's impossible to know. Wulong will probably reach the target of 15 pandas this year, in spite of Ling Ling and Wu Gung's slow start. These are some of their offspring from last year. The cubs' early ancestors lived around 2 million years ago. Their decline is due to us. Whether these pandas will become part of a sustainable population and survive for even a fraction of that time isn't the responsibility of Lulu, Ling Ling, or even Wu Gung. It's also down to us.
I'll get you. You probably will.
Oh, the other two, they just switch spoon positions, that's all.
Oh, give up.
Yay!
Decided to give up on the horse. He's just rolling all around the place.
That one's probably really young.
He's like, you hurt me. I give up.
Don't think I'd be allowed in New ever again. Yeah, so was the other one. She was climbing trees and doing somersaults. I did like this. I didn't like it. That's just they just sit. She's only been let out. She was only let out into this main enclosure. Ah. Okay. And then just let out a day or two.